Good afternoon, everybody. We have something like 70 people registered for this event this afternoon, so we've got a good proportion of those already here, which is great. This is the third, I think, in the series of events that we're running during the first half of this year under the theme of scaling up. Private investment in digital infrastructure is the title of this event. The session will last for just over 2 hours. Short intro, this is this, and then I'll hand over to Robert Skinner, who's going to be chairing the overall session. The first panel will run from until 3 o'clock. That looks at the policy and regulatory impacts on private investments. Short break, short comfort break for everyone, just about enough time to grab a cup of tea. Then we run the second panel through to just after 4, looking at the digital infrastructure or market developments in digital infrastructure. With a final wrap up. So just to let you know who the speakers are in case you haven't noted that down already. In the first panel we have Alex Blowers from City Fibre. He'll be leading that panel. Gita Sorensen from Goss Consulting, Justin Lepaterol from Swish Fibre, Robert Skinner himself from Octopus Investments, Charles Cameron from Cameron Barney, and Tim Stranack from Community Fibre. And in the second panel, led by James Sawnby from Grey Sky, we'll have Lloyd Felton from County Broadband, Nick Delfas from Redburn, Reef Reed from PMP Conseil, and Oliver Bradley from the Macquarie Group. So without more ado, I think I'll hand over to Roberts, if you want to take over and chair us through this session.
Okay. Jill, I can't turn my video on at the moment, it's disabled. Whether that's something you're able to change. I can just speak, that's fine.
I can't see how to do that, actually, to be honest with you. I'm looking.
Okay, that's fine. I can just speak. Anyway, so hi everyone, so I'm Rob Skinner from Octopus. So we're backing a couple of fibre operators in the sector, so Jurassic Fibre and Swish Fibre. And I think Malcolm's probably asked me to chair this event, as I've probably been more vocal on things like WFTMR and stuff over the last few months. So not quite sure whether this is a reward or a penalty. But look, I mean, this obviously a webinar is a slight tweak to normal INCA events and discussion forums, which have tended to be more about the operators and issues they're facing. And I think it's good to see quite a lot of the investment community on joining this board as well. I guess from our side as Octopus, when we've been looking into different investments in the fibre space, the things that's really focused the minds of our investment committee are the regulatory regime and DCMS and government policy. And now, obviously, those things are never completely set in stone, but they definitely come to a head more in the last couple of weeks. And I think this is a good opportunity to socialise our collective thoughts on where that leaves us as the investment community, looking at the altnet space. I mean, in my mind, I'm almost thinking like, so what? Effectively, we've had all these regulatory announcements and government policy announcements, and we've all been digesting them and trying to read the tea leaves about the hypotheticals for the last year. But now things are becoming a bit more concrete. It's just a good opportunity to start discussing amongst ourselves, what does this mean for us all? Now, I guess my role in this, I'm more really like a compare between the acts rather than the chair, as we've got 2 really interesting panels. As Malcolm said, so the first one's going to be focusing on policy and regulatory impacts on the investment environment. And so I'll hand over to Alex in a second, and I'm also happen to be sitting on that panel as well. And then the second one's more broad about the market and how not just the regulatory and the policy changes, but also how the private investors are looking at the sector and how the market's going to develop in the coming years. Chaired by James. So I guess with no further ado, I will hand over to Alex to formally chair the first panel.
Thanks, Rob. I've also got the same problem with the video. So I feel particularly upset about that because I actually changed into a proper shirt for the...
Oh, I did the same. Yeah, don't worry, it's not iron, so I haven't lost too much time.
Yeah. Anyway, nobody needs to see my ugly mug. So let me just make a couple of... We've got a very strong panel of people with some pretty firmly held and well evidenced opinions on the issues raised by Ofcom's recent wholesale fixed telecoms market review statement. But let me just make a couple of comments by way of preamble. So Ofcom's recent statement is the culmination of its attempt to kind of course correct away from the approach to regulation that Ofcom has adopted since its foundation in 2004, which has really been very much a focus on encouraging downstream competition in the retail ISP space and treating the Openreach infrastructure as a kind of immutable monopoly asset, regulating it accordingly. So Ofcom has said it wants to shift to a pro-investment mode of operation. It wants to reset its regulation accordingly, and all of these sentiments are very strongly set out in the press release that accompanied the WFTMR. And in particular, Ofcom states that it sees the mechanism by which its goal of promoting investment should be achieved is through infrastructure competition. In other words, through alternative networks like my own company, City Fibre, and others in the INCA membership, really driving the process by building out networks in competition with Openreach, full fibre, overlaying existing copper, grabbing market share and being successful. So really that's a sentiment that one couldn't really quibble with. At the outset, you would say, well, that's a really good place for Ofcom to be starting. That's exactly the kind of twin track approach, allowing return on investment commensurate with the risk that we're taking as investors, point one, and point two, allowing competitors to enter the market and to challenge for market share. What could be better? As we've all gone through the 1,600 pages of Ofcom's statement, there is a lot of good stuff in there. There are some very positive developments in my view. There are also some aspects which I think cause INCA members quite a degree of concern. And I think as we try and assess the overall balance of the good and the bad and the ugly in Ofcom's statement, it's really important that we understand and integrate into our thinking the investor perspective, because ultimately the question is not, is this a great Ofcom document for the policy wonks like me to get their teeth stuck into? The key question, the ultimate question is it the kind of statement that will safeguard and hopefully stimulate further investment in our sector, further investment to build out, as per Boris Johnson's goal, a national comprehensive full fibre rollout by sometime between the middle and the end of the decade. So for me, that's the essential question. Where does it stand in terms of that that balance of the good, the bad, and the ugly? And that's, I think, the question I'd love to hear the views of our panelists from, get their top line responses, and then maybe we can synthesize some of the key emerging themes. So on my list, I have, in this order, Geeta Sorensen first. So can I ask Geeta to give us her views, her take on the on Ofcom's WFTMR statement?
Just before Geeta starts, could I just say to people on the call, if you've got questions, put them into the Q&A, or you can add things to the chat, but Q&A is easier for questions. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Alex. Thanks, Malcolm. Yes. So as Alex just said, the WFTMR was built by Ofcom to be pro-competitive. It's pro-investment. It's encouraging investment and competition to the benefit of consumers. That's the banner under which this is being delivered. And certainly, I think for some business cases and some business models, that is the case. For operators that build in mostly urban areas, they have pretty good conditions, out of said. Also, I mean, that there is some improved constraints on on BT's ability to, let's say, price creatively and enter into arrangements with downstream operators that may lock up the market and foreclose competition. So there are some good aspects of the WFTMR for some market players. For a lot of the people who are on the audience of this webinar, who are either operators or investors in smaller competitors in the market, often not focusing on city centre or very urban areas, it's a bit more of a patchwork of good and bad. And I think, as you said, ultimately the bottom line is a difficult thing to decipher, and that's what really operators need to be spending time on in the next short time, is on balance, how bad is it, or is it good enough to continue? Overall pricing, Ofcom has decided to set the regulation of BT's or Openreach's wholesale prices in such a way that prices can go up by CPI every year, which is done intentionally to encourage investment, and that's done nationally, which is a good thing. We fought against Ofcom's initial proposal to set the prices in what Ofcom calls Area 3, kind of generally speaking, small towns, villages, and rural areas, setting that pricing much lower than in the rest of the country, which would have been very harmful to competition and investment by smaller providers. So we've overcome that, and that was a big win. But on the other side of it, we do have different market conditions in Area 3 from regulation than in Area 2, and particularly Area 3 is where Ofcom has asked Openreach BT to make a commitment to deploy fibre to a number of premises. Ofcom did not tell Openreach how many premises to include in that. It was a quid pro quo bargain to say, we will give the same price regulation in areas 2 and 3 if Openreach will commit to making some level of investment, because that makes the books balance, basically. Otherwise, there's a risk that BT would significantly over-recover, and that wouldn't be defensible from Ofcom's perspective. And BT then went ahead and made a commitment to deploy fibre to 3.2 million premises in Area 3. Those 3.2 million premises happen to be the 3.2 million premises that are most commercially attractive in Area 3, that are located more kind of accessibly from larger urban areas, and generally speaking, leaving the last 2/3 of Area 3, because Area 3 is about 9 million, to altnets or largely to government subsidy areas. So really what's happened is that Ofcom has indirectly given BT first refusal on 3.2 million premises in Area 3, where lots of providers are deploying, have deployed, are planning to deploy, and have fully funded business plans to deploy. And suddenly it's now Openreach's kind of first refusal to go there, with repercussions of whether or not it then becomes viable, given that this would probably speed up Openreach deployment in those areas compared to what they would have done if they didn't have this obligation. They would probably have put those somewhat later in their plan. And arguably, what's the benefit, given that altnets were going to deploy there anyway? What's the incremental benefit of forcing BT to do something that the market would have done commercially and willingly? So that's a big deal for a lot of operators, particularly those who are going for smaller towns as opposed to small villages and rural areas. Other drawbacks from the WFTMR include the rules that Ofcom has set for copper withdrawal, where there are real issues. I won't go into a lot of detail, but it is on balance still detrimental, I believe, to operators. And in terms of what that means to investment, it could partially foreclose the market by enabling Openreach and its downstream operators like BT Retail and Sky and others to lock up the market in people who are migrating from copper to fibre in a manner that makes it very inaccessible to competing network operators, which I think could be a significant competition issue. Other issues are to do with pricing. pricing of PIA access, which almost everybody who's building network today is using. They're using BT's ducts and poles, and suddenly Ofcom has changed tack on how prices for duct access, not pole, but duct access is set, and how the cost is distributed between BT and PIA users, so the PIA users use more and BT pays less. That's great, isn't it? So that could have a long-term impact on the viability of even existing investments people have made, never mind going forward. And finally, there's the issue of people who want to go to rural areas and are relying in their business plans on the use of BT EAD or OSA connectivity. This is slightly technical, but basically Openreach has recently introduced a surcharge on pricing if EADs or OSA products are used for FTTP backhaul, and a lot of operators are using it for FTTP backhaul and are planning to use it for FTTP backhaul. That's particularly a big issue for operators who want to be part of the outside in or gigabit project, where you're talking about smaller locations in rural areas that need that backhaul. It's not viable. We've done a lot of detailed analysis on whether you could use PIA instead, and it's simply just not financially viable to do so. Certainly not in the short term when you're just building the network. So again, I would have thought that will have possibly a very significant impact on people being able to raise funding for more rural deployments. So on balance, I would say good for the larger, more urban operators, bad to questionable for people who are outside that area, depending on, and the impact will depend on exactly what type of business model they are operating. You're on mute, Alex.
Thank you. I should have said at the out, I should have introduced Geeta or asked Geeta to introduce herself, but I think many of you will know Geeta is a veteran of many years of advising on telecoms regulatory matters, and has been working closely with INCA and with INCA members on the WFTMR. So thank you for that, Geeta. Can I turn to somebody else who I know has strong opinions on these questions? My former colleague, Justin Lepattrell. And Justin, again, could you just introduce yourself at the outset and then give us your pithy summary of the good, the bad and the ugly?
Yeah, hi everyone. So I'm Justin Lepattrell, 30 years across broadcasting and telecoms, both in industry, strategy and transactions, but perhaps most importantly, I was at Ofcom pretty much from the outset and stayed there for 13 years. So in a variety of positions, doing various things to do with regulation. In terms of Ofcom decision making, just before we come on to WFTMR, let's just quickly talk about another very big decision that's going on at the moment, which is the decision on switching provider. This is one area where if Ofcom follows through with its consultation proposals, this should be good for almost all providers that aren't Sky or Virgin. And this is because Ofcom has accepted, was proposing to accept a proposal which makes it easy, quick and simple for a consumer to switch provider regardless of the network that they're on, using a single touch. You don't need to go and ask permission from your old provider. You can go straight to your new provider. Now, at the point when copper gets retired, and there will be, as Geeta has said, a mass migration of consumers, having a simple process in place is absolutely critical to getting consumers across to a different network and a different provider on that network. There's been a late challenge to Ofcom's decision there. We're not quite sure what's going to happen. We're in consultation process, and we'll have to wait and see. But that's one piece of good news. Another piece of good news, as Geeta said, probably the biggest win out of the WFTMR was the inability of Ofcom telling BT that it couldn't discount its prices in what it terms Area 3. That's absolutely critical. That would have been existential, I think, for many operators. But I think what really comes out of this most is that Ofcom takes a very different view on what is commercially viable to both the government and operators. We get a very clear steer from government that government sees altnets as a critical part of a patchwork of rollout. It sees their value in accelerating that rollout and in maximising coverage. And anytime you speak to anyone from government, they're completely, and from DCMS, they're completely clear on this point. Ofcom doesn't take this view, or at least it's difficult to tell what its view is. Some people in Ofcom see altnets as valuable in their own right. Others see them as a foil to BT, as something that Ofcom can use to try and whip BT to get it to provide greater coverage. And that lack of a consistent position in Ofcom, I think, is partly driven from the top. Because unfortunately, for the last two chief executives of Ofcom, we've had generalists rather than people with deep industry knowledge. And that means there is a lack of guidance on this issue that comes from the top. So what does that actually mean? Well, Ofcom has defined Area 3 as about a third of the country. And it said that in those areas, material and sustainable competition to BT is unlikely. Now, at Swish and Jurassic, who I advise, we find this very strange because we're on public record as building around 750,000 homes, fully funded, entirely commercial, no subsidy, and almost everywhere we're going is in Area 3. What's more, we expect to see 2 networks present in those areas. Now, according to Ofcom, we sort of shouldn't exist. Its view is this is not possible. So we're left a little bit bemused by this. What's very clear is that Ofcom's position doesn't comply with what the government sees as the drivers of for commercial investment. Its decision to gift Area 3 effectively to BT means BT brings forward its investment to before 2026, the end of the market review period, and that in turn disincentivizes us and lots of other altnets from building in this area. As Geeta put it, BT effectively gets first refusal. Now that's a very worrying regulatory position, and one that we may well have to live with for 5 years unless somebody chooses it. So whilst I take a lot of comfort from what Ofcom's done in switching, a lot of comfort from what it's done in geographic pricing, I think that what it's done in Area 2, Area 3, and the geographic market definition for wholesale local access is disastrous for investment. I think it's a really, really bad outcome.
So don't feel that you have to pull your punches, Justin. Thank you. So I can't remember who's next on the list. I think it might have been Rob, but actually I'm going to break up the sort of Swiss Jurassic flavour slightly, if that's all right, Robin. I'd quite like you to kind of come back round at the end, just to give us maybe a bit more of a real world perspective. Is Tim on the call?
I am here, Alex. Yeah.
Hi, Tim. Can I ask you to go next?
Hi. Yeah. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Tim Stranack. I'm from Community Fibre, and as many of you will know, we're building a full fibre network across London. I think I'd echo some of the comments already made, just in terms of my take on the market review. I have to admit I've not read all 1,600 pages yet, but I'm partway through the catchy novel, but I can see that's not going to have an exciting ending. I think, just echoing Justin's point, there's an inference throughout it from Ofcom, and in some cases quite explicit, that they sort of see the altnets as a lever through which they get Openreach to invest in full fibre, rather than serious competitors to Openreach. And I think INCA's press release was actually very good, pointing out that if you count up the investment made into the altnets from savvy commercial investors over the last few years, we're getting towards £8 billion. and actually Openreach are only committing £12 billion. And the health and competitiveness I'm seeing in some of our altnet peers throughout the market, I think that £8 billion is actually going to grow over the next few years. And so there's every chance that actually the altnets will invest more in full fibre across the country than Openreach. And we really, and what we've got to try to do over the coming period and during the current market review period is actually convince Ofcom that actually no, their thinking is back to front. And it's the altnets that are the real competitors, the real innovators, the real creators within the industry. And if Openreach ultimately just has to become a duct and bowl organisation, then that's the way it's going to have to be. So I think part of our role over the next period is just trying to change Ofcom's thinking in that respect. The positive that actually comes out for it, and Geeta touched on it, is this will ultimately increase the cost of Openreach's wholesale services to its current customers, which in turn will make our networks more attractive. But either more attractive because we will keep them at the prices that they currently wholesale at, and therefore those customers will be attracted to use our networks, or we may be able to increase our margins a little bit and make our business cases look better because the floor that Openreach sets has been lifted. So there are positives that come out of that. So I don't think it is all doom and gloom. The returns on some of the networks that we've invested in may actually turn out to be even better than the returns we've already presented into the investor marketplace. So that's a positive. The one area that probably was most concerning to us was around PIA pricing, and a complete change in direction on that PIA pricing from January, when that PIA pricing had a CPI minus, effectively deflator, to a point at the end of the year with the market review statement where that PIA pricing has an inflator, a CPI plus inflator applied to it. Now this, Ofcom tell us, is to get to some hypothetical future state of cost attribution, which nobody really knows how that's going to work out, or how that attribution and sharing of ducts and how many ducts there will actually be in the ground in the future in a fibre only network will actually be made up of. And so we're resistant to that. However, we've run the figures through our own sort of business model. The price of poles comes down, the price of ducts goes up slightly over the year. In terms of the business model, it only has really only has a marginal impact. It's negligible. The much bigger impact, as I say before, will be the changes to the market wholesale price, because Openreach are being allowed to lift their prices, as I previously mentioned. And the only other thing of warning, which wasn't really part of the market review, but perhaps gives us an indication of how Openreach are going to play going forward, is the surcharge that Geeta mentioned to EAD pricing. So as a company, we don't use EAD at the moment. However, what Openreach have done there is found a little loophole within the regulations and found a way to sort of make some more money from their network and take money from other operators effectively. And now they've got Ofcom's backing to do that. So the question is, what else are they going to be looking at? What else are they now going to be looking at in this market review period to see what other prices might they be able to put up that will benefit their business model and detriment the business model of altnets? So that's one thing certainly we've just started to think about. What other prices are we paying to Openreach that suddenly they may put up at some point and cause us a shock? So that's perhaps my flag to the rest of you. It's just have a think about that in your business models as well. That's all I want to say as an opener, but I'm sure I'm looking forward to some good questions coming up.
Great stuff. Thanks, Tim. I wonder if I could ask Charles for perhaps a slightly distanced or objective take. I mean, what does somebody who's maybe not in the trenches make of all of this?
Yeah, look, you're right. I don't get into the trenches very often as I stumble into one when crossing the street. But I'm just by background, so I'm a partner at a firm called Cameron Barney. We've been pretty active over a number of years now in terms of raising money for many altnets around the country. We are and remain passionate about building fibre everywhere possible. And I suppose, so my take on the impact here, I probably don't agree with Justin that this is disastrous, but I totally hear the frustration there. I think that from an investor perspective, I'd make a few observations. First is that I think investors look at all situations really on the merits of an individual investment. The regulatory regime surrounding any investment, of course, is important. And mostly investors would just want to know that their regime is benign to supportive. So I agree with Geeta's observations, absolutely, that I think there's some features of what we've just seen in the Ofcom review that are less than benign, but how serious are they? I think is probably where I would take a view, because I think that when I read language, and when most investors, I think, are fairly cynical souls, probably with the exception of Mr. Skinner, but in the main, I'd say investors, they read words like pro-investment, and they probably think of them as we often read, progressive or sustainable. And we all know that there's probably, it's probably not quite as wholly good as it sounds. And I think that's probably the same here with what we're seeing for Ofcom. So almost everyone who's been in the altnet arena or raised money has watched over the years where Openreach has been given £1.5 billion of taxpayers' money because it's frankly not economic to build in the rural environment. Well, we've known that to be hogwash before, and it sort of still is hogwash. It's just a little frustrating, though, to still read that in 2021 after a fashion, when I really, that is disappointing. So I think there is a piece of work to be done. I think Tim is right. A lot more needs to be done to try to influence Ofcom to actually recognise that these things are not true. And the 8 billion of funding going into the altnets is a testimony to that. So I think that the current position is one where investors will look at the situation and probably will see two things. One is those who are already committed will probably just turn up their dial and try to move faster. Those companies who perhaps are teetering on the edge of thinking about raising money or getting started, I think they will struggle, because I think it's quite difficult, increasingly difficult, to persuade people of the benign environment. But I think those who are already in increasingly know how to operate in this environment, and frankly, have been operating in it for a long time. The stark reality is there's only a certain amount of speed at which Openreach can build. Almost every investor, including I think the investors in Swish and Jurassic and others, have an assessment as to what proportion of the market is going to be Openreach market anyway. In other words, what market share will they have? Now, maybe they dial back a little bit the market share because they may feel that Openreach might get there a little bit quicker. But to me, those are marginal calls. Humorously, and something perhaps we don't think about quite so much, is that I think that the cost of capital available to the altnets is increasingly lower than the cost of capital available to Openreach.
Wow.
So I think to myself, happy days to be a builder in Britain today. And because I think Openreach has a lot of competing demands, or BT has a lot of competing demands for its wallet. And I don't think that they necessarily can compete with a sort of capital that's increasingly pivoting towards the altnet arena, which is basically pension fund money. Obviously, we've seen infrastructure money, and over time, I think even the infrastructure funds will cede ground to even larger pension funds that like the built assets. So I actually feel reasonably optimistic in terms of the direction of capital and the direction of build. And then potentially, just as a counterpoint, but you know, I'd love to. I may well be proven wrong, but I think that there is the pricing decision could favour an internal debate within Openreach about sweating further their copper assets, at least those at the end of a fibre to the cabinet. I think there's little incentive necessarily for them to be busy rolling out when they can perhaps increase prices on existing solutions. So sometimes, regulation has a sort of perverse outcome. And I think that we may see Openreach still sweat more of its copper. And therefore, I would be saying, all power to those fibre builders, press on and seek lower cost capital, because I think it's available.
I think that's a really interesting and helpful insight. Lots to talk about there. I wonder if we can just loop back to our Master of Ceremonies, Rob, to complete the panel interventions, and maybe then we can pick up a couple of those themes in the time that we've got remaining. Over to you, Rob.
Thanks, Alex. Yes, I think again, I haven't read the whole 1,600 pages, but I've benefited from having discussions with you, Geeta, and everyone else on various different INCA discussion forums over the last couple of weeks or so. For me, I think Charles actually does sum it up quite neatly. This isn't the worst thing could have been kind of what Justin mentioned in terms of geographic price discount that really doesn't enable Openreach to be anti-competitive in certain areas. It is pretty frustrating that Ofcom has effectively, I think, put its fingers in its ears for the last 2 years and says, yes, we know you've done lots of building in the last 2 years, but we can only regulate Openreach, and it's just too difficult in my eyes to know exactly where everyone else is building. So therefore, Openreach has said they're going to build 3.2 million. Isn't that good? Yes, I know that may cause a bit of overbuild and frustrate a few people around the edges, but for the greater good, we'll get it done. It's that kind of attitude annoys me more than anything. I think it is in our investment cases that we're looking at. It does mean that, when anyone runs their models, kind of penetration is the key driver ultimately in all of our IRRs. That penetration rate is a blend over our build over the next 5-10 years or so. If as a result of this 3.2 million commitments, where Swish and Jurassic are building in that kind of area 2, area 3 boundary, it is now probably more likely that Openreach will overbuild us sooner than it otherwise would have done. It would have been neat if Ofcom had said no, or actually don't build there, move further into area 3. That would have actually increased IRRs for us and for lots of everyone else. And I think there would have been an even quicker land grab into that area 2, just in area 2, not in area 3 boundary. So I think Ofcom actually missed a trick there. And instead, you're going to have people will still build. It will just be slightly less attractive for us to build in locations. So that town may have been economic. Now, actually, we're going to go. We'll do it a bit slower. We won't do it. Maybe Openreach will get there first. So I think it will reduce the amount of money that is going into that specific region than otherwise would have been the case. But money will still flow there. I think Ofcom could have forced Openreach into more rural areas to actually extend the fibre footprint of the UK, which would have been better for the greater good. You also then have it links in with F20. You're going to have this ring around F20 where Openreach has been given a few more favours than anyone else. And so will that enable them to get better footholds in the areas around F20 to then allow them to be more bid more competitively in the F20 processes? That's another thing that the real disconnect between Ofcom and DCMS may, as a result, mean that more taxpayer money has to be used to build F20, or more of it gets given to Openreach because there's not a proper competitive environment for that otherwise would have been the case. So we've just got a bizarre scenario where I just think the regulator has favoured the incumbent. But we're obviously we're all mulling it over. People will decide whether they want to do legal challenges to Ofcom. So, but effectively, it is what it is now. And now people are debating what to do next. So for me, I guess a question that I think we need to be thinking about for INCA and the different independent operators and their investors is, what do we want to do now? How do we want to engage with Ofcom? They've made mention in the WFTMR about, look, we want to try and bolster monitoring of Openreach to make sure they're not being anti-competitive. So if there are instances of them abusing PIA data or knowledge and building where they haven't announced, things like that, which frustrates, I think it frustrated pretty much everyone on this call at some stage. Should we work together as INCA to be a louder voice of that Openreach monitoring unit, to shout loudly to Ofcom where games are played, because they have made a point about saying that they will beef up their presence there. I think there is an interesting debate about whether that Area 3 boundary could still dynamically move. In the letters between Ofcom and Openreach and WFTMR, there were conversations about, look, if the Openreach said if the Area 3, Area 2 boundary does move, you surely can't keep force us to meet the 3.2 million properties, or if something happens outside our control, you can't force us to meet the 3.2 million properties. Is that an avenue for us to say, actually, collectively, whenever an independent operator or Virgin or anyone builds in that Area 3, is there a case to go to Ofcom to say, look, this is something outside Openreach's control? We've built this town, please take it out of the 3.2 million. And don't force Openreach to overbuild us. That may not be a bad result. So I'm just interested to chat through those and see, actually, as INCA, can we now focus on that presence to I guess hold Ofcom to account about being the protector of competition, even though we may collectively think that they haven't done a great job in WFTMR in this area, but can we champion that a bit more? And then, yeah, we've got the next few years is all about the independent operators, I guess, gaining credibility in the eyes of Ofcom, so that next time we come into another WFTMR, which will kick off in 2.5 years' time, so it's not that long to go, that we're there saying, look at all the properties we've built. You surely can't ignore us now.
It makes a lot of sense. Thanks, Rob. So I just, before we sort of get into some of the questions raised, I just would like to make a general observation. So obviously my day job is working for City Fibre, and City Fibre feels as though it's kind of smashed through the glass ceiling in this WFTMR. I think one of the things that has been observed by a number of parties is that the weight that Ofcom attributes to City Fibre's build activities, for instance, in the Area 2, Area 3 boundary definition, seems to be different to that it allocates to other to some other altnets. One of the reasons for that, I think, is probably the existence of wholesale agreements that City Fibre has with ISPs, which means that Ofcom, in its way of thinking, sees that as a competitive constraint in terms of the behaviour of Openreach vis-a-vis its own ISPs. It's worth observing, therefore, that one of the key themes for INCA, one of its key themes last year and this year and beyond, is, as part of scaling up, is thinking about that wholesale challenge, because I think that is one of the things that potentially shifts Ofcom's view of the importance of infrastructure competition, is to what extent is it open to ISPs. More generally, though, I think you're absolutely right, Rob. The question really is, where do we go from here? And I suppose what I'd be interested to get a feel from panelists is, if we leave aside the super short-term issue that we all have for the next 2 months, which is, do we lawyer up and challenge some or all aspects of the WFTMR, which of course is an option available to all of us. What are the things that we actually want Ofcom to do now it's set its stall out? Where are the areas that we can influence? Where can we drive the right behaviour? And one concern I have is, I think Ofcom thinks it's done fixed telecoms now. And I think the senior management team at Ofcom will be thinking, you know, we've done that. We're going to do a mobile strategy next year. Why we need a strategy for a market that's working pretty well, I don't really know. And then they've got all sorts of stuff like online harms, future of the BBC, all the other stuff, which kind of, in my view, gums up the works at Ofcom, all demanding attention. And I just worry that we'll be slightly finding ourselves now parked in the, you know, in the been there, done that pile. So thinking about what are the things that we could actually gain leverage on with Ofcom to actually get them to proactively provide assistance seems to me to be really important. I just want to start with one point on that, which is from a government perspective, the Outside In programme, as several people have already mentioned, is their #1 pass-fail objective for this year. They want that programme to launch with a range of different providers competing for the Outside In programme and a range of providers making use of the revamped vouchers programme, both of which are orthogonal in some way to Ofcom's approach, because both are about encouraging altnet build in Area 3. So how can we take the statements that Ofcom has made about, for instance, monitoring for anti-competitive overbuild, foreclosure, how can we take those and actually bind those into a programme of work which is all about safeguarding the integrity of the Outside In programme? Because I feel that will be something that will resonate with everybody from Boris Johnson downwards. So I don't know whether anybody has any thoughts or views on that particular point. What could we push for that would help to make that case?
Alex, I'll step in with some initial thoughts on that and welcome those of others as well. I think it's worth, and this may be a message worth playing back into government, but I think it's worth thinking back to what was Ofcom set up for originally as a telecoms regulator. And my understanding out of 1981 was it was there to encourage competition into the market, to control the significant market player so that they couldn't squash the competition that was emerging, and over time play down that significant market power so that we could have an unregulated industry. And the question to government is, they've had 40 years to do that. Have they achieved their objective? It would seem as part of this market review, no, they haven't, because Openreach and BT Group are still there. They still have significant market power in the market. And so how long is it going to be for the regulator to actually do its job? And I think that could start to get some of government thinking about what is it that actually the regulator is there to achieve. I think Ofcom's actually itself trying to switch its purpose. It's trying to switch its purpose to become the protector of the consumer and away from the protector of competition, because why wouldn't it? I mean, a turkey's not going to vote for Christmas. So if it can get into the space of protecting the consumer, that's an ongoing thing that can last forever and ever. Whereas trying to encourage competition into a market has got to be a short-term, or should be a short-term, time-defined objective. So I think there's some messaging to go back into government and Parliament, which is, has Ofcom achieved the objectives that it was originally set out to achieve? And if not, what are you going to do about it?
Well, you've heard me. Sorry, Malcolm.
Just wanted to say that the point that Tim just made there links quite neatly into a question from Thierry Levenck on the Q&A, which is, given what the panel says about Openreach and the approach of Ofcom and the willingness of DCMS, i.e. the difference between DCMS, government and Ofcom around the altnets, don't you think a way forward should be for the government to change the objectives of the regulator? Perhaps another statement of strategic priorities? I don't know what you think about that. That sort of links to the point that Tim was just making there.
So that is a good question. I see Justin's got his hand up. Do you want to answer that one, Justin?
Yeah, so I think that's a really good point. I know that a lot of people on this call think that government does influence Ofcom regularly. I don't deny that happens. I just think it happens more in the broadcast, internet, content and harm space than it does in telecoms competition policy, where I think Ofcom is allowed to act as an independent regulator. So I don't think there are many opportunities at all for government to influence Ofcom. And as I said earlier, you only need to look at what happened with the WFTMR and the complete disconnect from the position of where government was to where Ofcom ended up. One of the more extraordinary things in the WFTMR was the fact that it barely references the F20. It didn't consider Area 3 in the context of the very sensible things that government said about how you define the bottom 10% and the next 10% in terms of whether a single network is or isn't viable. So I found that a rather extraordinary position. But the statement of strategic priorities should be a key determinant of any policy that Ofcom makes. And if you look at the start of the WFTMR, you'll see that it features very near the top. This is what the statement of strategic priorities told us to do. This is how we took it into account. Unfortunately, what you realize is that it doesn't really direct Ofcom to do very much. It's quite easy for Ofcom to say it's complied. For example, it doesn't specifically tell Ofcom to promote investment by altnets. It comes at that by a slightly different direction, but it doesn't completely say you should treat altnets on an equal footing with the likes of Virgin and BT when you're thinking about how to cover the UK with fibre. So I absolutely do think that the next statement of strategic priorities is something that we as an industry should put a huge amount of effort into. But another area where I would hope to influence Ofcom via government is in its consultation process. And we're starting to see a really slapdash approach to consultations now going on at Ofcom. There have been a number of big policies that haven't been covered with impact assessments, for example. Impact assessments are absolutely critical. If you want to introduce a new policy, you've got to see who's impacted and how, and you've got to weigh up costs and benefits. And Ofcom is now being very selective about when it chooses to do that and when it doesn't. We're seeing short 4-week consultations on things that merit 10 weeks, and we're given no reason why. Ofcom's trick, and I must admit, you know, this has always gone on, it certainly went on when we were there, Alex, is before you go off on holiday, just before the summer holiday, you gift industry a consultation to think over its entire Easter holiday, and you make them do the work. And you know, now on the other side, I realise how unacceptable that is. We've got that right now with switching, where the switching consultation is due to end on Wednesday of next week. And Ofcom has now just said it's going to give 2 weeks more because it wants us to look at a new proposal over our entire Easter holidays. Now, we need some proper principles around how consultation should be governed. We need transparency over the number of meetings that Ofcom has with BT compared to altnets, and the frequency of these and when they take place. And we don't have any of this at the moment. So I really think that we should be pushing for more transparency and a better consultation process. And I think we need to set better strategic priorities by government. Just one last thing is something that may change a little bit as we go forward is Ofcom's had a reorg at the start of this year. So the competition and consumer and strategy teams have come together now into a sort of big super group. And I think the theory might be that that stops the slightly siloed thinking that Tim was talking about. So in fact, Ofcom's mission has been to promote the interests of citizens and consumers where appropriate by promoting competition for some time. Nevertheless, most projects fall within one group or the other. I think the theory is we might get some more joined up thinking on that now.
That remains to be seen. Geeta in the chat has made a very good point. So Geeta, can I ask you just to elaborate on your point? This goes back to the question of what should we be pushing Ofcom on in terms of the implementation challenges, and you picked up copper switchover. Can you just say something about that?
Yes. So at the moment, there are some rules in terms of when BT can stop offering copper services, both at the wholesale level and also at some point when they can stop providing it altogether. What there are not are any rules around the process of migration. And customer migration is complex, as we all know. There could be reasonable justification by Openreach and all of Openreach's downstream wholesale customers to coordinate quite significant marketing campaigns, effectively crowding the market completely. But also importantly, it's possible that they would be able to migrate customers from copper to fibre mid-contract. So let's say that I'm subscribing to Openreach copper today, and my contract expires in 9 months. and Openreach is offering me to go across to fibre in 2 months. If I do that, I am now a fibre subscriber. I've got the benefits of fibre subscriber. The hurdle for altnet to attract me is going to be much bigger than at the time when I am consciously thinking about switching from copper to fibre. So that whole dynamic in the market, which creates a really big switching window, that should be something that fuels competition. Like Justin was saying about, you know, the switching platform, making switching easy and accessible. This should be one of the biggest times when people are actively considering what service they want, who they want it from. That could be largely foreclosed, and I think that could have a really big significant impact on the market in terms of penetration levels. Certainly rates of rise and increase of take-up from altnets can be significantly impacted by that. And I think we should try and see if we can not push Ofcom to set up some kind of monitoring working group, talking about good practice, the kind of things, you know, that happen around switching and number portability in terms of win-back campaigns and the kind of communication you're allowed to do. Why is that not done here? It's standard practice in other situations. It should be done here too.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And Rob, you picked up that point about working together to perhaps put more pressure on Ofcom to actively monitor. I mean, what would be the key things that you'd want Ofcom to be, the Ofcom monitor, the Openreach monitoring unit, I should say, to be absolutely all over in this implementation phase?
I think for me, it's it is that kind of where Openreach putting their 3.2 million. Are they announced them in advance? Are they suddenly switching because they see county broadband or anyone kind of building in a certain town, and suddenly Openreach's maps just starts adding an extra town and village, which was not in their plan. Whoever the altnet was thought they had effectively a yes, it's a fair competitive market, granted, but we all know that we look at where Openreach are building, like in the same way that we look at where the other altnets are building, then we go, looks like no one's building there. Let's try and build there. And Openreach do have this a greater anti-competitive ability than anyone else, and so can we work with the OMU to try and stop this kind of behaviour or limit it? And yeah, I do still think that there is this kind of I know there's a couple of Q&As about it between Lloyd and Geeta just now. That kind of, yeah, we did request, can Ofcom just take it out of the 3.2 million if someone built there? I still wonder whether there is a door there that we can say, actually, I know this was your plan and having a 3.2 million headline number is good, but you still get the 3.2 million if someone else has built there. And you may not need to force Openreach to go more rural, but just don't encourage them to open build. Or indeed, I think we were hoping for a win that they would actually somehow stop Openreach overbuilding people, but actually don't give them an incentive and just make sure they're not deliberately overbuilding exactly where everyone else builds in Area 3, because then you're making a mockery of your own Area 3 definition.
Charles, can I come back to you and your, I think your sort of helpful advice not to get too far dragged down into the weeds and sort of see the big picture here. But if there were a couple of things that you would want Ofcom to be picking up and perhaps INCA members to be pushing for in order to really bolster the investment case for the altnets, what do you think those would be? I mean, what actually moves the dial, in your view, if any of this stuff, from an investor perspective?
Yeah, it's a good question. Look, I think it is important to actually be down in the weeds on certain things. I think this ducting decision, okay, it's small numbers, but for me, it feels directionally painful if I'm an altnet and I see those kinds of things. So I think it is actually quite important to be down in the detail, as well as sort of, you know, high level. At a high level, probably I tend to think perhaps slightly differently, which I think is that the most powerful offices of state include the Treasury. And I think as a citizen, we should be really, really focused as stewards of the public pound. And I think it riles most of us when we see some of that public pound going to an incumbent, when actually the government, God love them, you know, in this environment, the whole, our government needs to repair its finances. So any opportunity at all to get private capital to build public infrastructure should be welcomed. And so I sort of feel that the Ofcom lens, there needs to be someone from Treasury sitting with Ofcom thinking about how do we make this financially efficient. So for me, the sort of financially efficient message just is not getting through, because what I'm hearing is all about competition. And let's be clear, whether Ofcom is moving in its view of consumer protection or consumer competition, of course that's true. Ofcom doesn't give a hoot about competition between networks. They just want to make sure that, I don't know, TalkTalk can sell its stuff over whatever fiber's there, or lots of ISPs can. They think that's job done. Well, we don't think that's job done. That's not, we are looking for capital efficiency, I think, here. Yeah. And I do think that the altnets have been terrific stewards of capital and terrific citizens, because they're building the public infrastructure, at a commercial level. So I think I'd like to see Ofcom have someone from Treasury sitting in the middle of them.
I think there's a route in there could be with DCMS and the F20 process, where actually with F20 there's lots of regulations that are coming with it. You have to build your network like this, and then so who from DCMS and BT UK is going to be monitoring that? That feels like a regulatory job. It's almost, you can see in the future, could there be those kind of F20 requirements get passed over to Ofcom, and that could be a route that we get Ofcom and DCMS and altnets in a room, and as you say, if BUK they're asking for, they want competition in this sector, and actually having them say that loudly in front of Ofcom could be quite a useful forum to kickstart the next 5 years of cooperation with Ofcom.
Yeah, absolutely.
Make a point from an INCA perspective, which is, I think that point really is one of the key lessons I think certainly I've drawn from this whole process, which is we have been reasonably successful with government officials persuading them that the altnets, and this is the altnets themselves that have done this, that they make sense and they can make a significant contribution, and they are investing seriously in building out infrastructure, and pretty happy to go into areas that Openreach says, sorry Gov, you have to pay us a load of money for that. But we haven't managed to persuade Ofcom of the same position, that the independent sector, apart from the notable exception of City Fibre, the independent sector actually does constitute a serious challenge to the incumbent. And that, to me, is the job that we need to be doing over the next period of time. It's going to take a degree of coordination, it's going to take some resources and some pretty hard work, but I think that over the next period of time we have to do that, because otherwise the investment isn't going to be there.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. I think we are just about at the end of our allotted time for this panel, unless you tell me differently, Rob or Malcolm. Were there any questions that we haven't considered? So shall we draw a line there? So thank you to all the panel participants. I think it's very clear there's a lot to do, short term, medium and long term, and I definitely think there's a dialogue to open up via the government to make sure that the government's very clearly stated policy aim of securing competitive investment in the Area 3 in the F20 is safeguarded. That would be my conclusion. So I think back over to you, Rob.
Yeah, okay, so I think let's take a 5-minute coffee break, and then we can kickstart the next panel, which is James chairing a session about the wider market and how that's going to develop in the next few years.
Before we go, I'm going to add one thing. Everyone's saying they had too much of a life and didn't actually get around to reading the WFTMR. I would say to those people, and I'm one of them, read Geeta's summary of it, but bear in mind you probably will need a drink afterwards. Nick, I see you're first, so over to you. Introduce yourself and your thoughts in terms of, very briefly, what you see as being the market. I suppose what I should just say, sorry, to padding out my part just a little bit first, there are two things that I see as interesting, and it's part of the way we see sort of innovation and change. We naturally overestimate what's going to happen in the next 5 years, because we all think that the great things that are happening now are actually going to work, and the reality is quite a lot of them don't. So what do you think is going to happen in the next 5 years? But the other thing is we massively underestimate what's going to happen in the next 25 or 30 years. So another thing, just what do you think is going to happen in the long term? How are things going to be really different? So perhaps focus on the 5 years, but give a thought to what's going to happen in the longer term in the market.
Okay, thanks very much, James. So I'm Nick Delfas. I'm a equity analyst in telecoms at Redburn. Redburn's an independent broker, which has been running since 2003, focused mainly on European equities, but we also do some US. So we'll be increasingly looking at that market as well. So I just want to say two things really. First of all, in terms of the next 5 years, as James was asking, I think that in the first session, maybe there's some misinterpretation of what counts as success for Openreach. And obviously I look at BT most of all in this space, also Vodafone to an extent as an altnet customer. But I think what counts as success for Openreach is actually quite a vibrant alternative network sector. If they can achieve the not too hot and not too cold outcome of having alternative networks covering 5 or 10 million homes in the UK, maybe more than that, with a share of around a third, 40%, 50% of those homes. That's actually going to be a very good outcome for Openreach because they would hope they would be charging the same price in the competitive areas as the non-competitive. They do have some big opportunities in terms of operating at a low cost across the whole country because they do have scale and they have existing employees and systems. And effectively, you could end up with a very nice situation for everybody where the alternative networks are making money and Openreach is making money as well. And the future, which many have talked about, which is a non-regulated future, would actually more or less be achieved. So I think don't be downhearted about the WFTMR. It's actually in Openreach's interest to achieve that kind of happy balance, I think, over the next 5 to 10 years. In terms of the very long term, just a glance towards the 10-year picture, I think that it's likely that the structure of BT will change. I don't think that that's going to change imminently, mainly because of the pension fund. So the pension fund creates an issue for BT in terms of separating the assets and liabilities out. It's not impossible to do, but it's complicated. If you scroll forward to the late 2020s, you'll have much more clarity on the pension deficit because you will have matched the liabilities and the assets much better. And it should become easier to think about breaking the company up. There's no benefit for BT in owning Openreach, in my view. In fact, it's actually actively negative for them because it creates a kind of comfort blanket, which means they don't need to be as good as they should be on the retailing side. So if you're really running BT for the long term, you would actually, I think, break the company up. But for the moment, that's probably a little bit too difficult. Final thing I'd say is from a public investor perception point of view, I think that Openreach is building at a reasonable rate. There's always room to do more. When we look around Europe, we're quite impressed by some of the innovative structures that incumbents are using to accelerate their build. Most notably KPN, with pension funds accessing capital to build additional homes, announced, I think, last week or the week before. And I would echo what Charles said about alternative capital sources. They are at a lower cost of capital. I think that's crazy, by the way, but they are at a lower cost of capital. And I don't think that you'll be the only ones tapping that. So I should imagine that Openreach will also look to tap some of those sources in the next few years.
Nick, thank you very much. Good for Openreach is a vibrant independent sector. I think while we all contemplate that and what Bill Murphy would have said, I think your comment about what's going on outside of the UK has got to be a bit of a prompt for Reef. So you're next on screen.
Hi, everyone. Pleasure being here today. So just as a way of introduction, I'm a senior principal at PMP, which is a strategy consultancy which advises, amongst other things, telecom operators and investment funds on their strategic and commercial bits around investing in infrastructure assets. So we work a lot around fiber, towers and data centers. And in the past 12 months, we've worked in France, Italy, the UK, of course, Spain, far-flung places like Manitoba, and also South Africa. So in terms of what's happening elsewhere in Europe, I think France is an interesting comparison, probably one I know quite well. But if you look at what Orange tried to do, Orange originally, they've got a huge head start, first of all, on OpenReach. They started building out fiber in 2007, and they're still not done. So that gives you an idea of how much time it takes to roll out these networks, even with a lot of ambition. And originally, what they thought, they could cover the whole market, but what's happened in the end, obviously we have very different regulation in France, but they've decided to cover 100% of high density urban areas, 80% of the medium density areas in France, which makes up about 50% of the market. And then you have another 50% of the market, which is rural in France, and where we have subsidized and de facto monopolies there. And in those areas, there's been a lot of competition, a lot of capital pouring in, because we have de facto monopolies. Investors are very patient and confident that we can achieve high take-up. So Orange has only managed to get about 25–30% infrastructure market share in those areas. And they've actually decided quite proactively to join other networks as a wholesale partner. So Orange has taken the view that they can't deploy everywhere and anywhere. And that in the end, they're going to have to use other people's networks. And I think OpenReach is probably going to have to come to that same realization that if they don't want at least their parent company, BT, to lose market share, they're also going to have to join other networks.
Ray, thank you very much. That is a very interesting point, and we are going to be getting back to that, I think, in some detail. Lloyd, I've got you next on the screen, so your point.
I think that a lot of this is going to be down to standardization, what happens next, and then leveling. There are a lot of the patchwork idea. However you look at it, you've got CityFibre, Virgin, who have broken through the glass ceiling, but there are lots of companies, of which County Broadband is one of a dozen or so, that are the next level down or the next wave down. And perhaps between us, we represent not an insignificant chunk of the market. So the challenge for us is to make sure that we are all able to present ourselves as one serious solution, because I think all the time that he's not giving up, is he? I think all the time that we are trying to do things independently, we are being divided and conquered over. And so our strength will come from having one voice. And I think that INCA has moved that agenda forward significantly over the last 18 months. And I think the membership is growing on INCA. And if we can combine as a group and talk in one voice, we become more credible. And I think our ambition really is to enable that to happen.
Okay, that is seriously interesting, isn't it? Because if mass trespass doesn't work, then collaborative mass trespass, that's going to be a serious consideration. Okay, more to think about. Sean, I have you next on screen.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sean McLaughlin. I'm a senior director at Aviva Investors, and we've invested into 3 altnets in the UK: County Broadband, you just heard from Lloyd, TrueSpeed, and ITS. Yeah, I mean, in terms of the market development, if you just take a step back, so we entered this market, or started actually committing capital not too far off 4 years ago. So I would characterize the last sort of 4 or 5 years as a real mobilization of capital, of mobilization of capability, build capability. And I think we're starting to see that pay some dividends. And that's really encouraging. And we're starting, I think, as a group of altnets of various degrees, it's starting to achieve scale. And I think with that scale, when I look at the next 5 years, it's really, from an investor perspective, and we have this kind of conversation with our management teams, is about focus on delivering scale and the benefits of scale, and taking advantage of that mobilization, that capability that's taken a while to develop, to actually take advantage of that 75–80% of premises that are still available. And I think we'll kind of be like nose to the grindstone, looking at developing and building our networks as quickly, as efficiently as possible. I think to Lloyd's point around standardization, I think that's a big point for in my mind, and how importantly the altnets do actually start working together in a constructive way, taking advantage of that increasing scale and then increasing market power. And I would like to see that come more to the forefront and see some tangible outcomes to that.
Okay, thank you very much. Again, there's an awful lot there to pick out that we will. I think we've seen Treasury looking at the impact, the importance of the ability to scale and deploy. Oh, Sean's gone. So we will look at that and the standardization a bit more. Panelists, do try and keep your cameras on, because it's reasonably amusing to listen to the panelists. It's even more amusing to see the facial expressions of some of the other panelists as people are talking. Oliver, if you're there, I got you.
You have, and I'm afraid you haven't got my camera on, because I'm dialing in on leave and from a car, so I'm sparing you that. But I'll describe my facial expressions sometimes for you. If that,
okay,
if that
I'm sure
helps.
emojis will work in chat.
Yeah. Thus far, it's been sort of nodding along, agreeing furiously, I would say, with the previous comments. I not just for those who don't know me, I'm Oliver Bradley, and I'm Managing Director for Macquarie Capital, which is the principal investment and investment banking arm of Macquarie Group. So we are not the fund's management arm. We're not investing other people's money. When we invest in deals, we're investing Macquarie's own money as principal. We invest across Europe. We have made one investment in the UK altnet space. We invested in Vonius, rural, initially fixed wireless, and we have just started building fibre, essentially where our fixed wireless networks have led. So we have a medium-term plan to overbuild our fixed wireless network with fibre and keep expanding our fixed wireless network and then coming behind with fibre. We've also invested in, we've now got to speak for 2 million home FTTH network in Spain. So a bit of experience of that market and how that works. That's a wholesale network. Initially, we bought 1 million homes covering urban areas. We've now bought another 1 million homes covering more rural areas. Obviously, the interesting difference with Spain is it's more, it's largely built, about 85% built, and quite competitive. So as an infrastructure investor, you have to get your head around the fact that you are overbuilt in the vast majority of your network, and how you deal with it. But there's still a role, we think, for infrastructure investments there. The only thing I've just sort of add from my perspective, particularly as a rural investor, is the altnets in the next few years, as people have said, have a role to build. Right, Openreach is going to build as fast as it can, and that's not fast enough for the UK. So we all have a role to build as fast as we all can, and that's the fastest way that for the UK to get as much fibre as possible. Then what happens is an interesting question, and and I think inevitably the scale point is very relevant. I think wholesale is going to have to become part of that conversation. And how do we altnets, who largely, with some obvious noteworthy exceptions, are not known for being wholesale and open access, even if we allow it, how do we transition to that, recognizing that hasn't been part of our business model in terms of how we've thought about the cost of capex, how we've thought about the ARPU, what sort of penetrations we have. So that's going to be one of the interesting things that we'll need to think about later, though not necessarily now.
That is an interesting concept, the idea that we don't need to think about wholesale just yet. I'm not quite sure how we think about that. Oliver mentioned that they're investing in Vonius, and they have an interesting strategy of kind of almost fixed wireless access first to get market share, and then build in with fibre behind that to provide that kind of investment infrastructure and the capacity. Sean, interested in your thoughts about fixed wireless access and fibre from an investment perspective. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, County Broadband's a great example. So their genesis is fixed wireless. When we invested in them, very little fibre. They've transitioned into a fibre provider pretty well. I think having both skill sets, it has a lot of value. So we're seeing them able to take advantage of the fixed wireless to lead into markets. Then you can backfill with fiber. You can use the fixed wireless as part of your network construction and design, which is quite helpful and can provide faster rollout, faster integration of your network design. So I think fixed wireless in that example is a nice part of that business plan, and I think it'll have its own merits as its own investment case in some of the hard to reach areas that that fiber maybe is just not economic for, even with substantial gap funding. So I think it has a role to play. I think we will continue to look to leverage that as part of an overall business plan, but with a focus on fiber ultimately. That's where we as an investor want to be.
Okay. Reith, there's a question, I think, effectively for you about Orange trying to do FTTC in rural areas, and that didn't work. So your views on other technologies, or or do we, is it just Boris's dream, full fibre everywhere by 2020, whatever?
Well, just on the Orange FTTC bit, Orange did indeed try to deploy FTTC in rural areas in France. The problem is the local loop length is so long that you get really lousy quality over FTTC, and it's just not worth it. So generally, the consensus in France was to leapfrog straight away to FTTP because it just didn't work in rural areas. And Orange took a lot of convincing to get to these rural public initiative networks, but they eventually got there. With regards to, I think FWA as a technology, I think Italy is a really interesting case study in Europe because it's the only country which has deployed FWA really at scale. There's currently about 1.2 million premises which are covered with FWA, and you have two quite big players, Eolo and Lincoln, which are doing that. And actually, there's a large player, a bit like a city fiber in the Italian market called Open Fiber, which is planning on covering 19 million premises. And they've won every single rural concession contract. And one of the ways they've won those concession contracts, which were subsidized, was by putting FWA for the 25% of the most remote premises that they're building in those areas, so they could get their overall capex and their overall subsidy required to a very low level. So I think in rural areas, FWA, especially on higher spectrum bands, can really play a role. I think over time, though, as you go towards the 10, 15, 20-year investment horizon, the fact that you need to replace the active equipment every 6 to 7 years just starts degrading its economics. And I think FWA is a good sort of stopgap measure. But I wonder over time if it just doesn't make sense to build out FTTP.
Interesting. Nick, then perhaps Oliver. Views on whether, or Oliver, you're going to say something there?
I was going to say, I mean, as an investor in fixed wireless, I think it would just echo quite a lot of that. I don't think we see fixed wireless in and of itself as an infrastructure investment per se. And I think the reason is exactly as just indicated, that if you've got to replace a large part of the cost of the network, which is the active equipment in the case of fixed wireless, every sort of 5, 7, 8 years, it does make it less infrastructure-y. Fibre is probably better where you can put it. So our strategy very much is we think fixed wireless, though, is what the good thing about fixed wireless is it's cost cheap to put up. You can get a decent service for people who have a terrible service at the moment. So it's quick. So our plan has always been with new communities is you lead with fixed wireless. It's not you're not duplicating effort there. In terms of thinking about backhaul and stuff like that, it will all be useful for fibre. You're leading with fixed wireless to secure demand in an area, to sort of secure an area, if you like, and then you follow up very quickly with fibre. And our aim is to sort of sign people up to 2-year contracts and to fibre them within that 2-year contract. So we do think fibre is the infrastructure investment. We do think it's the right future-proof investment. We will take it as far as we can. There will always be parts of the network where it won't be economic to take fibre to, and fixed wireless will always have a role for that. But that's ultimately how we see it.
Now that's an interesting point, isn't it? Saying that there will always be parts of the market that aren't economical for fibre. And I think if you look at the economics of deploying in really rural areas, most people think that that's actually true. And so we have two views: either, they're just not economical, they can't have it, or they're not economical. What are we going to do? How are we going to get fixed wireless access to work there? Nick, any thoughts on that dilemma?
Yeah, I'm probably not best placed because all these guys who are actually building networks have a better view of the cost curve. But I think what we've learned over the last few years is that the number of people who can get fibre economically is much higher than was originally thought, particularly by incumbents like BT who wanted to claim it was terribly expensive. So is the figure that can't be reached by fibre, 2% or 5%? It's certainly not 10. I
think we're starting to say it's possibly less than 1%.
So, I think this debate will be solved by the market. And I heard all the debates about Area 3, which is fair enough, and the way in which Ofcom gave its commitment for 3.2 million, and that I can understand why people don't like that. But the reality is that everywhere, except for a very small percentage, should turn out to be competitive. Italy is a great example of what happens when an incumbent is phenomenally badly run, because they've been bought out by a variety of people who've sucked cash out of the company, from Olivetti to Pirelli to Telefonica. And, fixed wireless then obviously has to bloom because there's nothing else that people can do. And open fibre is a government-inspired alternative, government-funded alternative to fill the gap, which may or may not now merge with TI. But fixed wireless is not the solution for Europe, I don't think. We're doing some work on what's going on in the United States, where you have very different economics for fixed, because there's no unbundling and no retail prices are far higher. And there I suspect that fixed wireless has got more of a story in parts of the rural US. But I think for Europe, we all have electricity to our houses. It's a little bit hard to believe that stringing a fibre is that difficult.
That is a good point. We all have virtually everyone has electricity. Malcolm, you have your hand up.
Yeah, just a question again for Nick, which is, to what extent do you think the changes at board level at BT may have an influence over BT and Openreach strategy, as an analyst who watches these things very, very carefully?
Well, I think from what I've understood from speaking to people at BT, the disagreement between the chief exec and the chairman was not over one specific major issue. So there wasn't a blow up around one particular debate, but it was a range of issues, and all in the bucket of wanting to go faster. So Philip Jansen is an aggressive manager, much more private sector perhaps than some of his predecessors well, maybe that's not the right word, entrepreneurial perhaps is the right word, because there's an awful lot of non-entrepreneurial private sector people in the FTSE. So I think, I don't quite know what precipitated the blow up, but it could be something to do with restructuring the workforce. And it could be to do with further extensions to Openreach's build, both of which I think are things that Philip Jansen would like to do.
This build capacity, and scale is an interesting one. So at the moment, I'm kind of in this short term. Actually, Lloyd, you're the one we're going to ask this question. Interesting question then. What's driving your direction? You've got two things that you know, potentially interest you. Let's be honest, you know, where's the money coming from? So is it private sector money, or is it government money, or is it both?
What's driving us is commercial. What's commercial? But what we have to consider outside of what's commercial is what's the threat. If we're not the company that is engaged in gap funded build, then what threat does that present? So we end up having to look at markets slightly differently because we're rural, because of what we're doing. The idea that you know, we build in this village A, B, and C, we build in A, miss B, and go to C, it's not really what we want to do. We want to build A, B, and C. And if we exclude activity in B because it's not fully commercial and that's gap funded, and somebody else comes and does that, then actually you can bet your bottom dollar that whoever comes and does that is also going to look at the other two villages either side, A and C. So you just create competition where we don't really want it to be. And duplication of effort and falling over each other in workspace and road space and permit applications and all the things that go with that. So we clearly are trying to look at a scale of deployment that works both financially and geographically, and the two things go hand in hand. And I'm sorry the answer isn't entirely black and white, but actually it's not, and that's where the difficulty comes. And when you're dancing in area 3 and crossing into area 2, that's what you have to deal with. And while the wireless play is a great play, it's, you know, it's an innovative play. The challenge with the wireless in the last piece is actually, don't forget, those are the hardest to reach, and that's also hardest to reach for wireless too. And if the government wants to see wireless as a potential solution, then it needs to change its thinking around licensing on the frequencies that work on those harder to reach areas. So, you know, we don't see wireless as the ultimate solution for the last 0.5% or whatever. It's got its own challenges to use wireless in those areas.
Okay, that's interesting. I think we are seeing that. We'll continue to see that. So. The consolidation then, that's something that we've kind of everyone's been looking forward to, shall we say, one way or another. Reef, your views on what do you see as being the conditions that start to cause consolidation? You start to see that in places.
Well, I think the UK is a bit atypical versus other European countries when it comes to the different network architectures and IT systems that we're seeing. There's as many as there are altnets. So I think consolidation will probably be a bit more complicated in the UK than it will. And I think the sort of main condition is that we get these altnets start getting up to the scale where they can start opening their platforms to wholesale, where they start making the investments, both ISPs and then make the investments necessary to open up to wholesale. And then I think consolidation has a lot more sense. So I think that will really be the key. And it's what we've seen for example, in France is a lot of consolidation between the different altnets and different SPVs being invested in and things like that. And I think Covage, for example, recently being bought out. And the easy part there was actually the fact that they built common standards. And I think that's really what INCA has to do over the next few years and is really key, is getting to those standards which allow for easier consolidation.
Nick, you're nodding encouragingly or something.
Yeah, I think that if you look at the vertically integrated players, you know, there is a reasonable level of penetration growth, but it could always be faster with a wholesale model. To get to a wholesale model, you need to have the volume to excite the major ISPs, which probably means 1 million or 2 in reality. So you all need to club together to create that kind of pool in order to get a Sky on board, or indeed a Virgin outside Virgin's area. A lot of consumers do buy bundles. So, even if you speak to happy G Network customers in London, they're wondering where they're going to get their football from and how they're going to do that exactly. So you shouldn't underestimate what consumers like to buy, and therefore the importance of offering your product to the normal scale wholesalers. I think if you look at other markets as well, I think I'm right in saying, such as New Zealand, although there's a huge tail of ISPs, the retail market is still quite concentrated. So then you obviously have some prisoner's dilemma issues. Will City Fibre, who's got maybe one of the largest bases, really open up its ordering system to county broadband? They would be effectively giving away their scale advantage in some way. So you're going to have to get over some of those issues and club together with operators of a like size.
That's interesting. So I'm always tempted to go straight to Lloyd on that, but Sean, your views on that. So if you're the companies that you'd invested in were to then sort of partner with other organizations like City Fibre, how would you view that? Would it be them, your in a sense, are we talking about the smaller operators taking advantage of the scale of City Fibre, or is it City Fibre dominating those small players? Which way do you think it's going to go?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I guess I think of consolidation from a couple of different angles. One is what we've just been talking about, is a little bit around standardization, maybe the path to wholesale, clubbing, the idea of altnets clubbing together. I mean, there's always going to be discrepancies in sizes. The standardization of network design and technical aspects better promote wholesale. I would have thought it does. Is it for the benefit of small and large? I think it probably is. So I think that part of it is an entity like City Fibre going to get really excited about talking to a 5,000 premises passed altnet? Probably not. But as part of the whole INCA platform, you can say, okay, actually this is interesting for everybody. And I think it obviously it needs to work for everyone, or City Fibre is not going to be involved. They're not going to play. Equally, for some of the smaller altnets, if the conversation gets dominated by larger players, then it's not commercially advantageous for them. So that's where the idea of INCA and actually a club, and that's it's not easy. I can appreciate that, but if those kind of challenges can be overcome, then I think you can lead to taking advantage of the scale that is sort of here today, but is certainly over the next 5 years going to change quite a lot, and that altnet platform is going to become really meaningful. And how do we as a group of altnets kind of plan and execute that? And I think the execution part is the challenge, and it's a question I'd like to get I guess a bit more feedback from the audience, as well as how if all the altnets sitting here today think this is a good idea, what are the real steps? How do we execute that and actually drive that agenda? Otherwise, you could see it drift over time, and nothing happens, and then we kind of lose the opportunity.
It's an interesting question, isn't it? Sorry, I said lots of interesting questions this afternoon. Probably 10 years ago, when one of the sort of the pioneering heroes of the independent sector, Barry Ford, was starting out on Barn, he said all sorts of things. He said that a community can build a full fibre network and operate it. He said that the ISP was dead and no one needed them anymore. Now, I have to be honest, much to my surprise, he was right about the first thing. He was right. A community can build and operate a sustainable full fibre network. So far, the CPs have gone from strength to strength. But how long does it last? Reef, are you starting to see anything different elsewhere? Or Oliver, you're there in the background. Are you talking to us?
Yeah, sorry. I was going to say on that point, I think it's one of those situations where it's just important for altnets not to be complacent, because while it's patently true, I think that you don't, if you build a community project or you're a non-known brand or you're a vertically integrated network, you can be perfectly successful, and most INCA members are. The reality that we all have to address is that the marketing might of the big ISPs, the big the big open reach customer ISPs, BT, Sky, Vodafone, and TalkTalk is enormous, and the power of the switching websites and that sort of thing, it's very hard to compete with. And indeed, as an infrastructure investor, we sort of like to stay out of that competition if we can. We as infrastructure investors, have a preference to not, as a general rule, and Sean can correct me if he feels differently, we have a preference to not have to deal with end customers. We have a preference to deal with B2B. Now, we perfectly happily deal with end customers where it makes sense to do so. And I think in rural, currently in the UK, it does so. My biggest concern investing in more urban networks in a vertically integrated model is not that those businesses are bad or wrong or won't succeed. It's just quite hard to get your head around having to compete with Vodafone and TalkTalk and Sky from a marketing perspective when that's just not an infrastructure type risk. I think that's sort of the fundamental point. So, ultimately, as an infrastructure investor, we want to build fiber networks and then ultimately allow anyone to be able to use them. I mean, I think that's ultimately what we want to do. How we get there is an interesting question. But the CP will survive because people want to interface with big brands that they've heard of, and their marketing power and their pricing power will enable them to compete, I think.
Nick, I think you.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to a question on the chat. How independent does a common wholesale platform need to be, and is it just about scale for the major ISPs? It's partly about scale, and it's also about provisioning and confidence in provisioning. So when we speak to Sky and others, what they care about is the customer experience above all. So for them, they're not going to jump just for £1 or £2 in the wholesale price if they don't have the assurance that the customer experience will be good enough. So it's quite a complicated area, but I do think that for maximizing the investments that you're all making, you need to try and solve this problem above all. And in fact, I'd go so far as to say that probably quite a lot of the other questions about what Ofcom has and hasn't done are quite secondary to fixing some of these things in your own backyard, if you like.
I'd like to think that some of the operators have something to say about the what I like to call the world-class customer experience that TalkTalk gives.
I don't think I did talk about Sky for a reason, not to talk.
Fair enough. Lloyd, any thoughts on that?
Yes.
Come on, share.
I think that there's a couple of unknowns here that the market is changing, and I completely accept that a vertical market is not the be all and end all, and with open arms accept that needs to change over time, but one needs to create a certain amount of stickiness or revenues to support the build in the first instance to get the momentum going, and that's what a lot of those that are doing vertical are doing. I think most companies who are offering vertical integration see a long-term play in wholesale, and certainly in the group on the common wholesale platform that we're building, there's 4 companies come together to collaborate and put tens and hundreds of thousands of pounds into a project that is designed to all about wholesale. So clearly the momentum is going that way, but the unknown is the lock-in between the operator and the content being provided. I just think that's going to change. I think it's going to be something that over time you buy it as you need it. So anybody can buy anything over anybody's network. I think that's going to be what we're looking at. And anybody that anything needs over anybody's network is probably going to look very different in terms of how the consumer pays for that and who the consumer pays for that. Do they pay Amazon directly for their content? Do they pay the network operator for their content? Do they pay for the amount of data they're consuming to get the content? Or does Amazon pay the network operator for being able to deliver its product over that content, over that network? There are so many factors that I think are, this is new ground. It's really exciting. It's a really exciting arena that we're operating in. If we just apply traditional models to it, I think that thinking will be a little bit staid.
Can I add one thing? Sorry, I've now turned on my camera because I've arrived home. So I'll try and do some facial expressions. The only thing I'd add to that as well is what we haven't talked about is convergence between mobile and fixed, which we haven't seen so much of in the UK, but it's a much more common theme in other European markets, particularly in Spain, where we have investment as well. The concept there being that people will buy data and they will consume it where they want to consume it. If they'll consume it in the street and they'll consume it in the home, but they're doing the same things in the street and in the home. They're watching computers, they're doing video conferences even. They're doing the same things in the street and the home. So the idea that you should consume, you buy your mobile data or think about your mobile data differently to your fixed data that you use at home is probably, may become anachronistic. And that's the other sort of role, I guess, the CP sort of have in that again, and therefore the importance of networks as distinct from the service provision over them in the future. But in the short term, I also agree, as with what you're saying, Lloyd, and we agree that in more rural areas in particular, vertically integrated makes sense. Just we don't have the scale to be a wholesaler, or the ability. There's no wholesale option. If we just waited to be a wholesale network, then no network will get built in rural areas. So you have to be vertically integrated initially. But I think we do, as an industry, need to have a plan for how we are going to let the big CPs onto our networks in a sensible way. And that is a challenge, how we do that in an economically sensible way.
You did mention about people consuming data while they're at home and while they're out and about. Those who from time to time have to walk through London Underground stations wish people would really stop consuming large amounts of data while they're wandering about. They are just a menace to shipping. I've got a question from Clive Downing. Are the smaller altnet operators' platforms really as technically varied as Reef suggests? We probably haven't got the best mix of people on the line for that. So as evil consultant, I'm just going to say, yes, they are. And that might save us some time, unless, Reef, you've got anything further to say about that.
I think just looking at the different business plans that I've seen, there's different architectures, different IT systems, and overall, there's a different touch to every business plan that I've seen for.
The one saving grace is that the majority, certainly in rural areas, the majority of the investment is in putting the fibre infrastructure in place, and they're all pretty well single mode fibre. They're all standard. So I suppose that's something. How are we doing for time? We're actually getting close to the sort of final wrap up. So I suppose one of the things that I kind of like to see. What do we see as the really long-term point about this? Do we see that we're going to have some form of mass consolidation in the UK? Will there be half a dozen big players covering everywhere? Or will we be as we are now? We've got a few big players, one still dominant player, and smaller independents making up the rest. What's the market overall going to look like? Sean, you haven't said anything for a while. What do you think?
I think that there'll be, there's quite a few altnets out there of various sizes. I think some will kind of run out of steam and maybe get, in terms of a consolidation pathway, I can see some over the next short while maybe getting acquired. But personally, I think there's a lot of capital that is now backing, you know, a good number of altnets, and they're going to be looking to deploy that capital, build those networks. And then there'll be I can see, when is that? Is that in 2 years, 3 years, 4, you know, within the next 5 years, then I think you'll see management teams, investors going, okay, where have we got to? How do I continue to grow? What's sensible? Is there a growth opportunity that's accretive to my investment? You know, some typical drivers of consolidation is to reduce costs, you know, and to grow market share or network. So I can see that being a driver. I can see also that for the short term, you know, there's needs to be a focus on just building. You know, there's still a lot of network to build. You know, we're only at 15% odd. So it's difficult to consolidate network that isn't built yet. So I would say, yeah, I would just, my feeling would be you'd see a lot of just, again, nose to the grindstone. Let's build some networks.
Reef, long term?
Long term, I think what investors will be looking for before they start consolidating is three things that we've seen in other European markets. Is one, that cost per premise passed is managed and stable, and that it's well understood in the different areas where they're building. The second thing is that these operators have actually ramped up and are capable of delivering and have delivered substantial networks, but at least if they're capable of building 10, 20,000 premises a month or less or more. And the third thing, which I think is important, will be getting more comfort on what we see as future penetration on these networks and long-term penetration. And I think those are the sort of the three things which at the moment we've made a lot of progress on, but needs more progress before people start putting in their money in and consolidating these networks.
Oliver, thoughts for long term?
Yeah, I think inevitable long term. I think scale is important. You know, it doesn't make sense, but echo the you know, the previous comments. There's not a lot of benefit in buying other people's business plans. You want to buy other people's homes built, and you want to buy their, you know, their capacity to build. In the meantime, I think the market is best served actually by being fairly widespread, by being investment fairly widespread, because we're all just getting on with it. We're all building as fast as we can, particularly in rural areas where where the areas are smaller. So I think that the market's best served, and the UK is best served by us all getting on with it. But I think inevitable long term once things are built.
Lloyd, 20 years time, will people say, "Oh yeah, OpenReach, I remember them"?
No.
You think not?
No, absolutely. I think that there's a lot of sense in what's been said and the responses that have been given, and I come back to a lot of this will be driven. A lot of this change will be driven by how things are consumed differently over networks, and until some of that plays out, it's going to be hard to be very clear about, you know, is it going to be possible for smaller players to maintain networks? I certainly think some are going to run out of steam. There's no doubt about that. Some have smaller ambitions. Some are backed by, you know, venture capital as opposed to long-term funds, and that's clearly a flag as to what their immediate term and mid-term future is thinking. And other funds are much more long-term, and those funds are looking at, you know, to secure returns over 30, 40, 50, 60 years. And that's how they think. And that's how those funds operate and have done all this time. Why should it be any different on this market? So I don't, while there may be some merging of networks, I think some of the key investment money behind that will stay. I don't think those investors will leave the market.
Okay. I've just got to this point, and I just suddenly thought what the ultimate question really should have been all the way along. It's a bit annoying, but I will at least say what the question was. 35% compound annual growth in the amount of data that users consume year on year has been for ages. How long's that going to carry on? Because that actually affects everything. But anyway, I guess it's time to hand back to Robert and for the final wrap up.
Thanks, James. Yeah, look, I think it's been a really interesting debate to hear everyone's views. I think it's I think where I come out is, as I think Lloyd put, that this market's going to move quite materially over the next few years. No one quite knows exactly how it's going to play out. Wholesale is definitely interesting to hear that it's so much more on the forefront of people's mind than maybe it was a year ago, and something's definitely going to need to happen there in the medium term. The question is when and how is the key thing that we're all grappling with. And I think what's going to come out of this, both from the first panel in terms of regulatory and lobbying and DCMS points, but also on the wholesale platform side of things, will be the importance of more INCA working groups and collaboration to discuss how we move forward as an industry. Because I think all the investors behind the altnets are confident and keen and believe that this sector has a very good future. It's the reason why we backed the sector with such there's a market opportunity that Openreach has left open for the benefit of all of us. So how we effectively collaborate to take advantage of that is all the key purposes of INCA, I think, over the next year or two. Malcolm, any other final comments from you?
Well, apart from saying thank you very much to all of the panelists and the participants, people both asking questions and joining in and so on. I think, yeah, clearly we're moving at pace. Everybody is building as quickly as they can. The investment is being deployed. There are challenges ahead, both the regulatory and policy environment, but there are certain things that we should be doing collectively a bit better than we have been doing, and we need to focus on that, which I think is pretty clear to all of us who are involved in this sector. The altnets have got a good story to tell, and we need to tell the story better. We need to think about some of the issues to do with standardization that have been raised in this panel and wholesale and how that's going to work, which we are doing. So I think it's going to be a very exciting time ahead, and I think it's great to have such good quality people prepared to spend an afternoon discussing some of these issues and putting forward their thoughts and their expertise. So I want to say thank you very much again. So enjoy the rest of the afternoon. Thanks, everybody.
All right. See you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Yeah, bye.